That was an auspicious start. Jim, he did remind me to turn on the mic before I started my chair duties. So I want to welcome everyone to the Committee of State Bar Accredited and Registered Schools first meeting, and I'm going to ask Michael to take attendance and roll call.
Jackie Ferradina, Santa Barbara and Ventura College of Law.
Here.
Dean Barbieri.
Here.
John F. Kennedy. Greg Brandes from San Francisco School of Law.
Here from St. Francis.
St. Francis, sorry. Kareem Gongora.
Present.
Member of the Committee of Bar Examiners. Martin Pritikin from Concord Law School.
Present telephonically.
Thank you. And Brian Pirtle from Empire College of Law.
Here.
That's everyone.
All right, thank you. I want to remind everyone that this meeting is webcast, and there are cameras in the ceilings, as well as to remind people to turn their microphones on when they're speaking, but then to turn them off when they've concluded speaking so that it doesn't pick up all of the miscellaneous noises. When we have public comment, you're welcome to come up, turn on the microphone, and provide the comment that you want to provide. I want to turn this over to Natalie and Amy for a welcome.
So normally we would actually welcome you as the new chair of CS Bars. We want to welcome everyone to the inaugural meeting of the Committee on State Bar Accredited and Registered Schools. This committee has an expanded charge offering formal representation for the registered schools for the first time. And the State Bar welcomes your advice on the rules and guidelines, your advice as to recommendations for working groups and topics for further study. So thank you to everyone for being here, and I'll turn it to Amy.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank everybody for being here. And as you're going to hear throughout this meeting today, we have a lot of activities related to the bar exam, related to the admissions process, related to things that are relevant to the law schools here in California. So I look forward to the collaboration that we're establishing here, and also on working with all the activities that are coming up here at the State Bar. So thank you for being here.
And I also want to welcome everyone, and I also want to just say a thank you to the State Bar, the Committee of Bar Examiners, and the Board of Trustees for allowing this kind of collaboration to continue. We had a rules advisory group that was an opportunity for accredited law schools to be engaged in the guidance and responses to some of the changes or suggested amendments to the guidelines and rules. And I think it's fantastic that now we have an inclusive group that both includes accredited law schools as well as registered law schools that can be part of the broader conversation. I know that there's a lot of potential changes to the guidelines, some of them going to be discussed today and going forward. So having the ability to provide guidance and recommendations to the Committee of Bar Examiners and the Board of Trustees hopefully will make a stronger set of rules and guidelines, as well as ones that the schools will welcome. So thank you. All right. So at this point in time, there is a general call for public comment. So if anyone would like to come forward and speak about items on the agenda, you're welcome to do so. I understand that Jim Fox would like to provide a public comment.
I would be happy to. Thank you very much. As the chair of the Committee of Bar Examiners, I also would like to thank each of you, members of the new committee, for volunteering your time and your efforts. Those of you who have been following the bar over the last 5 years realize that there have been significant changes made to the bar. Some were welcomed, some were not. The legislature has weighed in and has mandated that the sections spin off. And the legislature also weighed in and has said that the state bar really is not, quote, an association, although many people still refer to the California State Bar Association. We are not an association, we are a regulatory agency. And I think that the restructuring of the bar is ultimately going to be in the best interest of the public. And hopefully the legislature is seeing the progress that's being made. There will be additional changes, and that's certainly why this committee is so valuable, because we do seek the input of both the accredited and the registered law schools. And I think that this forum is very, very important to provide that information for the bar as we continue to move forward. So again, I would like to thank you. I know that the Board of Trustees is appreciative of all of the volunteer work that is put in furthering the goal of the State Bar and public protection. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Are there any other public comments? So we can move forward with the agenda, and just as a note, we're going to reverse a couple of parts in the agenda to accommodate for people's schedules, as well as wanting to make sure that we complete the business of it. So State Bar updates 1 and 2 are going to be reversed, with the bar studies first and the bar strategies and stories second. And then the expansion of the demographic data collection will be set specifically at 11 a.m. So whatever we're in the midst of around 11 a.m., if we haven't yet gotten to that particular item, we're going to stop and then move forward with the demographic discussion, so to accommodate schedules. So the first thing we want to do is a discussion regarding the bar studies. Amy?
Thank you. All right, good morning. So, I will be presenting on the 5 separate studies that, 4 of which have been completed by the State Bar, and one of our ongoing, or currently underway studies. And so I'm going to start with the recent performance changes on the California bar examination. So this is a 2017 study that was conducted, and that used admissions data to evaluate the historical pattern of the California bar exam pass rate and changes in applicant characteristics. This study relied on data from 2008, 2012, and 2016, and it observed the following changes over that 9-year period. The number of test takers declined by 6%, including an 11% decline in the number of July test takers and a 4% increase in February examinees. Another finding that resulted from this study was that the distribution of the examinees shifted, with traditionally higher performing groups making up proportionately less of the total test takers over time. For the July exams, the overall average total scale score and bar passage rate dropped between 2008 and 2016, where the average TSS, that's a total scale score, declined 66 points. This is from 1481 to 1415. And the percentage passing was lower in 2016 than in 2008. Less pronounced decreases also occurred in the February exam over that same time period. The findings in this study suggested that there are other intervening variables that may be impacting applicant bar exam performance, and as a result, the State Bar decided to embark on this study, which merges law school performance data with individual information about student credentials. And that's the last study, as you'll see there, part 2, that I will be discussing. And one more thing that I should have opened up with is the fact that we were directed by the Chief Justice in 2017 to look at the various factors that may be impacting the bar passage rate, and that's the context of these bar exam studies. The second one that we completed was the standard setting study, which I think a lot of you are familiar with. Again, this is a study that focused on the analysis of what the appropriate pass line or cut score should be for the California bar exam. That study utilized a job analysis that was conducted by the National Committee of Bar Examiners in 2012. The full report contains a detailed description of the methodology that was employed, an explanation on how the data was synthesized, and how inferences were developed. The study concluded that setting the pass score at a combined scale score between 1388 or 1504 would meet the standard required for the expected level of knowledge, abilities, and skills required for entry-level attorneys. The next study was a content validation study for the California bar exam. That project and that initiative sought to examine the overlap between what's being measured on the exam and what is a critical knowledge required for entry-level attorneys. So the process of content validation involves determining whether the exam content aligns with job-related knowledge, skills, abilities, and tasks. And the outcome of this study resulted that the content of the examination actually matches job-related expectations for the practice of law. That is, that the California bar exam aligns with job knowledge expected of entry-level attorneys. And as mentioned, the last part of the bar exam studies here involve the merging of student credentials with California bar exam performance. So using detailed data for over 7,000 students from 11 ABA law schools who took the bar exam in July 2013, 2016, and 2017, there was an analysis conducted on the impact on bar performance. So between 2013 and 2016, just as a reminder, the pass rate on the bar exam fell 56%, from 56% to 43%. In 2017, the pass rate rebounded slightly to 50%, but declined once more in July 2018 to 40.7%. Using the data on pass rate and student credentials, the study found the following. The first is that changes over time on the characteristics of exam takers accounted only for some of the decline in bar exam performance during that study period. The study found that these changes accounted for between 20 and 50% of the decline in bar exam performance during that study period, depending on the performance metric that was chosen and the year that it was compared. The two student characteristics that mostly strongly predict performance on the California bar exam are a student's GPA in the final year of law school and a student's LSAT score. Another finding was that changes over time in the entering credentials, that is undergraduate GPA and LSAT, and law school credentials, such as the final law school cumulative GPA, contributed roughly equally to the proportion of decline in the bar exam performance attributable to changes in student characteristics in that study period. The proportion of test takers who were ethnic minorities and female grew slightly over the study period. However, the study found no correlation between these demographic characteristics and pass-fail outcomes among students with similar abilities. Ultimately, the study was unable to account for a substantial amount of the decline in the pass rates, concluding that other unexamined factors have contributed to the decline in bar exam performance. So where we are now with the bar exam studies, we are in the process of undergoing the California job analysis called the California Attorney Practice Analysis, the CAPA. This body of research examines the expected skills of entry-level attorneys. As you recall, when I talked about the content study and the standard setting study, we used data from a job analysis that was conducted by the National Committee of Bar Examiners in 2012, which may or may not mirror the current skills expected of attorneys in California. And as a result, we've decided to conduct a California-specific job analysis. The goals of this study are to ensure that the exam content, that is the breadth, depth, and complexity of that exam, is related to the knowledge and skills required of entry-level attorneys. The study will also provide a documented link between exam content and current legal practice. We'll also assess the adequacy of the exam format in testing requisite knowledge and skills. It'll provide a blueprint for question development and selection. And lastly, it'll inform the development of a minimum competence definition for standard setting or for looking at the cut score in the future. There are 4 components to the job analysis. First, a panel of practicing attorneys will assist in defining the classification of knowledge domains and skills as a basis for creating a practice analysis survey. The next component is a survey disseminated to all California licensed attorneys that will collect data on attorney practices in terms of their knowledge and skills required to perform their daily tasks. The third component is a detailed data gathering that's going to happen in 2 separate modes. The first is a traditional one-time survey response. The next is a relatively new approach called the experience sampling method, and that's going to provide participants the opportunity to respond multiple times, perhaps like 2 or 3 times a day, at random selected moments where they get to answer questions about the task that's being performed and its associated attributes. ESM's immediacy provides a rich data set with more detailed and accurate information than a one-time questionnaire, hence the 2 different methodologies. The last component to the job analysis is a focus group of participating attorneys that will provide feedback and validation of the survey findings as a way of synthesizing the study itself. So with that, the last thing I'll mention is that where we are now, our working group is going to be presenting, the deans from the working group will be presenting at the Law School Assembly, May 7th and 8th. At the stage of the project right now is we have completed the first set of the component, and that is the classification of knowledge, domain, and skills has been developed. The CAPA plans to meet tomorrow here in San Francisco, and we will have more information from the deans at our next gathering. So with that, are there any questions about the bar exam studies that are ongoing now?
I mean, I have a question. Forgive me for poking around on my computer while you were speaking. This is Greg Brandis. I was trying to find the study that you labeled the content validity study, and I don't seem to have it. I wonder if you could arrange for that to be distributed to the members of the group. I think I have the other ones, but I don't have that one.
Okay.
And I certainly remember that conversation coming up in this context of the standard setting study, but I don't remember the separate study. So if you could provide it, I'd be most grateful.
Yes,
Thank you.
I can do that.
And I have just a quick question, and this might be a combination for Ron and Amy together, which is, once the job analysis study is completed, will there be a content validity study done again to respond to whatever we learn in the CAPA working group?
When we initially planned all of the activities for the job analysis study, the plan was to follow the normal sequence of examining any testing in terms of the content cut score, which is start with practice analysis, and then using the information to look at the content alignment next, and then look at the cut score based on findings from all of the previous studies. So theoretically, yes, that's the whole point of conducting a practice analysis, is to use the information for subsequent bar exam studies.
Thank you, and because it's California specific, is what we learn going to be applied specifically to the California portion of the bar exam, or will it be applied in theory across both days?
We don't have oversight over the MBE, so the data is for the California portion of the bar exam. But however, I do also want to recognize that the NCBE is also undergoing a job analysis. We are coordinating with them to ensure that our overlap is synchronized. And so I imagine that they're going through a similar process after they are finished conducting the job analysis, the nationwide.
Dean?
Hi, this is Dean Barbieri from John F. Kennedy University. With regard to the content study or any of the other studies, is there anything on the table for considering a revisiting of the format of the examination? Because we went from 6 essays and 2 performance tests to 5 essays and 1 performance test. And a lot of other states are going the other direction and adding performance tests as opposed to taking performance tests out. And I participated in the content validity study, and I was hoping during that study there was more opportunity to talk about the format of the examination as opposed to just the subject matter of the examination.
I would just talk about the content of the practice analysis. It will provide information to assess the relative importance of knowledge domains versus a different set of skills. So if the findings indicate that certain skills are more important or more relied on to perform the day-to-day task, then certainly there's an implication to reevaluate the weight of essay performance versus the MD kind of questions. So it's open for us to look at all of those, the format, the weight, all based on findings from the survey.
Thank you. So Ron, this is Greg Grandis again, not to belabor this question. The minimal competence definition part, does that come in after the job analysis and before standard setting, or is really the definition of minimal competence, is that really the standard setting? Kind of because you're picking a cut line, by doing so you're sort of defining what we mean by minimal. Where does that fit in? That's what I'm curious about.
Job analysis won't provide information that's directly applicable in standard setting study, but it will provide you with a lot of information to inform the discussion about the definition of minimum competence. Because you can imagine in our survey, we not only included the different domains of knowledge as well as the different skills, but also some additional rating questions related to the importance, frequency, criticality, and the expectation of knowledge. All of those will provide very rich information for us to discuss and have a more rigorous definition of minimum competence. Aside from the survey data, the follow-up focus group will also hone in on all of those issues to see whether the survey findings can be validated by day-to-day experience with attorneys. So several ways of trying to get to that question, and then later on when we are ready to conduct the standard setting, we will have rich information to come up with exactly the kind of format of definition for that purpose.
Okay, yeah, and thank you. And you also got into my other question, which was, I think you mentioned that in the CAPA, you've already defined the domains of knowledge and skills. You sort of touched on that. Is there anything more to say about that at this stage of the game? About what those definitions look like?
It's not so much a definition, but rather a classification and organization of the knowledge domains and tasks. So briefly about the work from the working group and the panel, which has yet to be validated by the working group, along with beta testing of the survey itself. So it's still a work in progress. Basically, it involves 2 dimensions. One is really what we call performance domain. 4 areas of performance domain, and within each we have additional detailed list of tasks. So that's one dimension of what we're going to survey on attorney practice. The other is simply knowledge domains. We started out with 13 content areas on the bar exam, and the working group expanded that, and we ended up with 19 knowledge domains. And within each, the panel members further define the subdomains. So it's a very comprehensive list of knowledge domains and tasks. we also conducted comparative analysis of the outlines from the panel with some additional similar outlines to make sure that it's not only comprehensive, we didn't leave any major gaps, but also it's consistent and coherent in the organization.
So not to go too deep down the rabbit hole, one last question about this. Those are the ones you're going to survey about and check. They're not necessarily defined as required for new attorneys.
We don't define from
We're
the
just
survey.
checking.
We use the survey response to evaluate and infer from the results to see what's required.
Exactly. So if somebody came up with an idea that they thought belonged in the knowledge domain, but the survey came back and said, we never have to use that,
Right.
then that would not be included in the job analysis as a requirement for first year practice.
That is the process.
Got it. Just wanted to make sure I understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Amy. And I believe you will be available at the law school assembly as well. Is that true in case other deans have
Yes.
similar questions?
Yes, I was.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. And I want to invite Tara Clark to come forward. Thank you, Tara, to do a presentation on bar examination strategies and stories program.
Good morning, thank you. So today I'll just be providing a brief overview of the California Bar Exam Strategies and Stories program, and you'll have the opportunity to hear from the researchers at the Law School Assembly in May. So the California Bar Exam Strategies and Stories program is currently being offered by the State Bar in conjunction with researchers from Stanford University, Indiana University, and the University of Southern California to applicants for the July 2019 bar exam. The program was previously called the Productive Mindset Intervention and was offered prior to the July 2018 bar exam. It began as an initiative of the Council on Access and Fairness, staffed by Access and Inclusion here at the State Bar. The program was designed for U.S. law students taking the bar exam for the first time. It is an online educational program designed to address the barriers, friction, and stress that applicants experience in the summer when they begin studying for the bar exam in earnest. The program includes an introductory film, audio and written stories from prior test takers, and a module in which participants write letters to future test takers about how to use the insights and strategies shared. Students are asked to complete the program in one 45-minute setting, although the total time will depend on the student's pacing with the materials. Overall, the program was developed to help test takers find productive ways to interpret the challenges, obstacles, and negative experiences associated with preparing for the bar exam, so as to improve the test-taking experience and exam performance. Results from surveys and focus groups highlighted the main areas of concern for applicants, which the program addresses as fear of failure, not having enough time, a lack of attention span or being able to focus for long periods of time on studying, a lack of confidence when comparing themselves to other students, financial concerns, strained or isolated relationships, and lack of self-care. The preliminary results from the 2018 program were promising, as the program increased the likelihood of passing the exam by at least 7.4%. However, the sample size was small. To increase the sample size for this year, applicants are able to register for the program at the end of the bar exam registration application in the new admissions information management system, or through the reminder emails that are being sent out. And immediate exam repeaters are now able to participate. While registration for the first wave is ended, the second wave of registration with limited spots is open until June 7th, 2019. The program is free for applicants and participation is voluntary. For those students who have signed up for the first wave, they will receive access to the program on May 20th, 2019, and the second wave will receive access to the program on June 17th. And are there any questions?
Thank you for that update. I noticed that part of the name is strategies. Are people sharing strategies about how to be successful answering questions on the bar examination? The reason why I ask, my background is, well, people know, I was a director for examinations for 10 years, and I graded bar exams for another 18 years. And one of the things that I came across then and I come across now in legal education is there's so many myths and inaccuracies floating around about what the bar examination is and what students have to do to be successful on the bar examination. And one simple thing was you always have to look for the hidden issue, and there is no hidden issue on the bar examination. And so when we talk about strategies, I just didn't know if this was strategies about how to do things in managing your life and exercise and eating and things like that, or is it strategies about how to be successful taking the bar examination?
I would say it's a bit more of the former, so it's not going to tell them how to answer questions or look for it or things of that nature, but more so maybe some of the stressors or things that applicants have come across in their personal lives while they're preparing for the bar exam and how to harness those things that they see as stress into positive energy to help them focus and do better on the exam itself.
And if you find when you're looking at this, if you find that, because everyone loves to talk about how they were successful on the bar examination as far as what they did and how many multiple choice questions and where they studied and things like that and how to approach questions. My only caution is if you see that happening, you may want to talk with Lisa and other people who are so involved with the grading and development of the questions to make sure that there is not a continuation of the dissemination of inaccurate and confusing information that will just perpetuate these myths that have been floating around for decades. So thank you.
Kareem?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I had a question. Do you know if there's any overarching study connected to this, or is this kind of more just a singular focused study that's providing strategies, or are we looking at it from a more like broad perspective to where we're connecting actual people passing and looking at what the actual outcomes are going to be for the next, I'm sure it's in its infancy stages, but what are we looking at from 5-12 year perspective, or is there any idea if we'll take that direction?
I can help address that, answer that, Kareem. So this is one of the first times that this strategy is being implemented in a licensing exam. This strategy has been used, and there's a lot of literature on middle school, high school. As a matter of fact, the actual scientists working on this are coming to do a presentation to the Law School Assembly on May 7th and 8th and can provide that background. But it's in infancy stage for a licensing agency, but there is literature on the work that's been done in different schools here. So I think middle school and high school.
I guess for me, personally, I'm trying to figure out how it all connects, because we look at it as we want those students that are engaging in this strategy to be successful. So how do we make those systems communicate to where we're making those identifications? Is it manual? Is it through our new administration system? Or have we not got there yet? Because of course we just started this. But I guess for me, I just would feel comfortable that's something we're looking at down the road.
So you mean communicating with the applicants themselves? Because
yes.
What we've done is we've incorporated the registration process for this exam as part of the bar exam registration.
Okay.
We've also have a way, and we've done this, of sending email reminders of those who have already registered and did not register for the bar exam strategies, a follow-up email to register them. So there have been multiple opportunities for people to participate who are registered bar exam applicants.
So I guess this would be like a query we would pull, maybe like next year or 2 years from now, and saying, all right, we've had 40 people into this program, we had 40 people successful, this works. Is that kind of the idea?
Yes, and so, but just so you know, if you look on our website, and I think we shared this with the CBE, and we could share it with this group too. We do have a fact sheet on the results of the first wave that happened in July of 2018, and so we have there is information on the group that this strategy was successful.
Oh, cool.
With, so.
That's where?
It's on our webpage. I shared it with the CBE, but I'll share it again with this group, and you'll be copied on that.
I believe there's a 7% difference between those who went through the productive mindset and bar pass rate compared to those who did not.
Yes, I think Sarah just reported it was a 7.4.
That's good.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
And Tara, just because this is the Accredited and Registered Law Schools Committee, is there, out of those who participated, were there many from the Registered and Accredited Law Schools? Is that something that perhaps we should encourage our students to be involved in?
I don't think that we, or at least I don't have that specific data. I think it was more so they just let us know that the program was designed for the U.S. law school students taking the exam for the first time. However, they didn't differentiate which type of school they attended.
Okay. Okay, and so thank you, Tara. I appreciate that presentation. So now we're going to have a discussion regarding the new admissions computer system. And Natalie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. So just a brief update. We've had a lot of communication with the students, but not as much with the deans. So just to update on what we've been doing with the Admissions Information Management System, affectionately called AIMS here. This is a brand new custom designed Salesforce backbone system that we're using here in admissions to communicate first with students and eventually with law schools as well. So it opened to the students at the start of the registration for the July bar exam, and when it opened on March 1st, within the first 4 hours, 2,000 students began to access the system. So there was immediate adoption from the students. We are working on making it easy, responsive. We do have a tech support line. There have been some questions along the way, and we have been working to help the students get through that. There are a couple of little tips that I'll share with you just generally. First of all, we're sending information to students about email. Not all students read email anymore. So please do let the students know it is more important than ever for them to register at the start of their law school career. They're asked to do so within 90 days. Most do, but it really is best if all do. And that's going to be their entree into AIMS when they begin using the system. When they create materials, they still will have a workspace to create their materials. They won't be seen by the bar until they submit using the button marked, not surprisingly, submit. And in particular, for your students that are seeking testing accommodations, we would encourage you to use the online system fully. What we're learning so far is that the students listen very hard to what the bar has always said in the past. And previously, we required physical live signature documents from the treating providers. But now we can receive and do prefer to receive those documents via the online system. So all of the processes that the students do can be received online, and we would appreciate any help that you can provide in letting the students know that. As for the schools, the first schools to use the system will be the registered and accredited schools. We've created a shell to begin that communication, and for those of you who have time to stay, we invite you to join us for a brown bag peek at the system designed for the registered and accredited schools to file standard motions as well as your annual compliance reports, MPR, and other similar types of reports. If there are any questions, I would be happy to entertain them.
Seeing no questions, we can move forward with the agenda. As I understand, there's no recent developments that we need to cover today. So we'll move on with the business portion of the agenda. First up on the business portion is updates for forms and process for accrediting distance learning law schools. And if we time this right, then at 11, we'll be able to move forward with the presentation on the demographics. And then we'll return to our standard. I skipped over something on the agenda, excuse me. So first, we're going to talk about examination of remote proctoring for state bar examinations. And that's going to be with Tammy Campbell.
Thank you.
Sorry, Tammy.
Good morning, everyone. So as we mentioned, we're going to talk about the online proctoring that the State Bar is exploring right now. Over the past several years, administering the California Bar exam has presented various challenges, with one of the primary challenges involving proctor recruitment, specifically hiring a sufficient number of proctors that can be not only proficient at the job, but as well as being able to train these new recruits to pick up and go right into a room and handle the job that they need to do. Historically, the California State Bar has maintained a steady proctor pool to draw from for each exam administration. Over the years, that proctor pool has reduced in size due to a variety of reasons, including the fact that many proctors have been working with the State Bar for many, many years and are aging out. Excuse me, and as well as reduction in the number of people that are looking for seasonal work assignments. When proctors are not available, the State Bar uses personnel from temp agencies, which not only increases cost, but is resource intensive and is less efficient in administering the bar exam. Given the challenges in providing sufficient quality proctors to ensure an effective administration of the examination, the option of online proctoring has been explored as one method that might contribute to the improvement and quality of the bar exam administration. Online proctoring increases the quality of proctoring as it uses both a behind-the-scenes proctor staffed by the online proctor company and artificial intelligence to detect cheating or erratic behavior. Online proctoring can accommodate multiple applicants per online proctor while utilizing artificial intelligence to monitor eye and body movement and reports any findings back to the live human proctor. It has the capacity to allow the online proctor to communicate directly with the applicant as well as with the on-site staff. Although there would still be proctors on site at the test centers, it would require far fewer proctors than our current proctor pool. Vendors are currently being researched to verify the best company to meet our needs, and most importantly, online proctoring will also require approval by the NCBE. In June, online proctoring will be tested at 2 test centers during the first year law students examination, and this will be able to provide us an opportunity to see how it works and to better prepare for implementation for online proctoring during the administration of the July 2019 California Bar Examination. Does anybody have any questions?
Is this going to be for the general, like the open convention center, or are you looking at testing accommodation sites where they're proctor intensive?
We are actually going to do it at both. We're going to test both the standard and the testing accommodation site, so that way we are doing it on both sides and seeing the benefit on both sides of our examinations. Yes.
Sorry, this is Brian Bertillo from Empire College School of Law. So how mechanically does this work? I mean, is this like you're saying it allows a remote proctor to be able to make eye contact or at least see the eye and body movement on these cameras everywhere that are now being focused on each test taker?
Yes, so what we've seen so far is that there is a gooseneck camera that would be set on the table in front of the applicants, and that is able to monitor their movement, eye movement, if they reach in their pocket, watches them while they're testing. And on the other end of that is an actual live proctor who is monitoring all of that activity and able to communicate directly with the applicant if they see something that's not right, but also communicate with our staff who are running the test centers so that they can come up and be involved with what's going on and check the situation.
So are we going to add that to the strategies and stress reduction class and how to deal with something facing them while they're taking the test? I'm kind of serious about it.
Yes, and I think it's going to be a learning curve for us all to get used to. Our goal would be to try to make it a smooth transition to not impact the students to come in and have to feel pressure from this going on. It's very similar to still having a proctor in the room. The difference is this person's on a camera versus the person who's sitting here looking at you from the side, watching you test in person.
It'll be really interesting to
yeah.
see what first-year law students do with this. They're
Yes.
taking the first-year exam.
Well, and we anticipate, the 2 rounds that we plan to use as our experimental phase to gather information such as that. And also, there are 2 methods for the actual observation to occur. People could use it off of their laptop as well as this gooseneck camera. We'll probably experiment with both options. But the other thing to consider too is that we do have students that currently use that as a testing framework. So, for example, Greg Brandis' school uses online proctoring. So for some students, it'll be a very similar testing format to what they use right now. We are trying to use the least intrusive So if you consider like a camera would really replace somebody who's actually sitting there observing you. So hopefully it will be less stress reducing. The other thing I want to highlight too is one of the strengths of this online proctoring is, aside from having a live person on the other end, there's also artificial intelligence that's looking at erratic eye pattern or hand pattern that will help us in terms of the monitoring or consistent monitoring in the process. So, your point stands. I think it would be something to that we'd be curious about is the impact that it has on the students as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
And this is Greg Brandis. I'll just chime in that obviously in the online world we use this to verify identities and other things that are important for the bar exam setting as well. I think it's very powerful. I think it's a great thing that the State Bar is looking into this. It provides the opportunity to actually record what's going on the person's computer, so you can ensure that they're not accessing something they're not supposed to be accessing. You record the environment around them, so that if they are indeed looking at the inside of their sleeve, that AI will kick that right back. And as the dean of a school, I get reports after every single exam taken by every single student that I have to go and look at and decide whether that represents a violation of the testing conditions we set up for that particular exam. But it's incredibly valuable, kind of keeping everybody straight, following the rules. And they get over it pretty quickly that they're face to face with somebody. At least our students do. They're used to that because that's how they study. But you might want to have them practice it a little bit before they go take their exams.
Greg, how many students per proctor in your school?
Well, in general, it's a remote proctoring company. They have 10 or 15 students that they're monitoring at a given time. It's kind of a Brady Bunch screen that they have, that the actual remote proctors have. And so they're hopping from one to the next, and they can review what's going on. And then again, depending on the particular vendor and the provider, the AI sends them an alert if something is going on, so that the student reaches under the table or something, or they reach in their pocket, or they do some action that's a little bit out of the ordinary. The AI will pop up a flag for the live proctoring people. And for us, more importantly, it records that activity. So we actually see on the camera what the person did. Good examples of this are things like the phone rings, because their phone is somewhere off in the corner. Well, that will pop up if that unusual noise occurred during the exam. Whether they answer it or not, then it will pop up as a warning, and you go look at the video and you say, well, they didn't answer it, so there's no violation. Or they did, and then there is a violation. So it's very interesting and very useful.
Well, I appreciate your presentation, Tammy. Thank you. Look forward to more information.
One quick question
I'm
on this
sorry.
topic.
Yeah.
Hi, Tammy. I just wanted to ask, so this is going to be at 2 locations. We're looking at piloting it. Do you know how many students we're looking at overall?
For a testing accommodation site for June, I think it's going to be somewhere around 15 to 20.
Okay.
And for a big test center, it's going to be 125.
So one of my concerns when this was presented was the quality of the camera.
Mhm.
So what were the mitigation measures that we implemented to kind of jump over that?
I think we mentioned that we're going to try to test the format of everyone using their laptop that already has a camera, and that seems to be sufficient for the online proctoring. The other is a gooseneck, and this is a camera that is used for other licensing agencies and universities and law schools for their testing. So it is the method recommended by the vendor.
Okay. And then there was another situation brought up where somebody actually hacked the source code and was able to cheat. Do you know if there's been anything that evolved from that, or have we kind of already addressed those issues?
Two things. I remember that was part of the vendor's presentation, and that person that wrote the source code, they ended up hiring to help with their security systems.
Yeah.
We are going to, is really set up for taking the exam from your home for the most part. We still plan on having people at our test site locations. We're going to run our basic security that we do now.
Okay.
That is, you can't bring anything into the room, including cell phones. So the chances of, for example, somebody pulling up a cell phone will be will not happen. And also, we're gonna have live monitors in terms of, rather than having a one-on-one, we still have the section monitors or proctors that will help monitor that process. So, what we're trying to do is alleviate some of the one-on-one, but we still need the monitors that hand out the exam, that are still monitoring the floors and are available in the event, like Tammy described, where we get alerted that there's something happening that we need to address.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Tammy. I think it's now safe to move on to the business portion of the agenda. It's almost 11, but I don't think you have your co-presenter here yet, so we will hold off on just a moment. And Natalie, do you want to start with the updates of forms and process for accrediting distance learning law schools, and then we can move to the next agenda item?
Sure, thanks, Jackie. I'd be happy to give the background for that. So I will set up the background for the discussion that can continue after the presentation from Access and Inclusion. So we'll be presenting to CS Bars today the rule set related to online accreditation of law school programs, as well as the application that we plan to use for the registered schools seeking accreditation for the first time. And just to give everyone a little bit of background, these rules are not new. They were first discussed beginning back in 2013. They have gone through comments and feedback from the public, from 2 different working groups, from several trips to the Board of Trustees, public comment, and more. When they were first considered, they were considered along with another proposal that remains under study, and that was a possible mandatory accreditation path for registered law schools. That proposal remains under study, but there's no reason not to go forward with the online amendments. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. The amendments that we will propose to you are the ones already approved by the Board of Trustees in exactly the form that they were approved at that time. They simply have the mandatory accreditation item stripped away. It is expected that the registered schools will have an initial accreditation application, while the Cal schools will use the major change process in order to increase the online presence as part of their JD programs. And just for a little bit of context, this will be extremely novel in the law school world. California will be the first state in the United States to allow a fully online program to have an accredited status. The ABA is looking at online very seriously. They just recently upped the amount of credits that can be part of a JD program to 30 credits, and so you are seeing around the country some hybrid JD programs pop up, but California will still be unique. Now, step back, though, and look at many other programs of education in the United States, and many programs have been fully online for quite some time. And so, in many ways, this is very innovative in law, but when we look across education in general, online teaching is really at a very mature stage, and so we are hoping that the schools will be able to take advantage of truly a very mature educational technology. So that's a little bit of the background, and we look forward to sharing the specifics with you after the presentation from Access and Inclusion.
Yes, so I want to invite Helen, who is the Director of Access and Inclusion, and Carolina Almaraz, Program Office of Research and Institutional Accountability. These presenters will explain the BAR's
strategic goal to collect data on a consistent and expanded set of demographic categories through the annual report for a number of purposes, including looking at the gap between attrition for a Caucasian student versus other groups. And schools are going to be asked to volunteer about their current programs related to academic support, especially for diverse law students. So, Helen and Carolina, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I am Helen Hall. This is my 3rd month here at the State Bar, so it's a pleasure to be around you. What we'd like to talk about today is why we are doing this, why do we feel that it's important, and what we hope to ask you to help join us to design and help us improve the annual report that you currently already provide the State Bar. So with that, as many of you know, the State Bar revised its mission 2 years ago with a specific emphasis on access to and inclusion in the legal system. And the statutory directive from the legislature also reflects this very specific language on access and inclusion. So with that, the last 2 Board of Trustees meeting has really focused on what does access and inclusion really mean, and how has the Board of Trustees helped identify what the goals
Laura
are.
Palazzolo, Dean, Lincoln Law School of San Jose.
Has left the conference.
I won't take that personally. Why is it important? What does that mean when we talk about access? And what can we do in order to achieve that goal? So this strategic goal was just adopted in the March Board of Trustees meeting just last month. And as you can see, it is a pretty ambitious and goal. But what I really want to focus on is the last clause, which is that we want to strive to achieve a statewide attorney population that reflects the rich demographic of the state's population. And clearly, this is not going to be achieved in the State Bar's 5-year strategic plan, but really it is the guiding goal for the board to see how do we move towards having our licensed members and the attorney population reflect the rich diversity of our state.
Has joined the conference.
Now, this is the overarching goal, and there are about 24 singular objectives about what the State Bar wants to do to help get to those goals. I think what's most relevant for this group is why the board has focused its effort, understanding that pipeline issues in education are very complex. The board identified the issues in terms of where the board can be the most influential and the most impactful is really looking at law school retention to graduation. And so we'll be talking about what the data was that was presented to the board and how they decided to identify what we can do in order to help support students of diverse backgrounds progress, persist, and graduate through law school. And I want to be clear, this is one area of many different areas to support communities that have been historically not traditionally represented in our legal system. And so we're not saying that this is a panacea, that this is the end all be all, but this is one additional strategy where the State Bar wants to really show what we can do and how we can improve to support students from diverse backgrounds. And so in the Law School Assembly, we'll be talking about this, but then also highlighting, asking law schools to ask, what are you doing in order to support students from diverse backgrounds that have been successful? How can we then share that information with other institutions? And what can we be doing as a community to help those students? So with that, we're going to talk about, well, what do we know and what is it that we really need to know to tell the better picture about why students have to exit law school and what can we do to help support them. This is not just about enhancing the data. I can tell you when I look at your annual report right now, it's not helpful that decline to state and other is one category, right? So there are things that we can improve, I think, just from our annual report, but part of what we'd like to do is ask, what is it that you already collect and what is it that you want to know in order to better tell the stories of the students? So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Carolina.
So earlier this year, the State Bar implemented a new demographic survey for its licensees. And much of that work included taking the existing survey and including best practices for collecting demographic information. And this is all part of the diversity efforts that the board is encouraging us to pursue. And in that, we were able to understand some trends. And just to note, the survey was rolled out in the early part of this year, and we are still collecting information, so this is the information that we have to date. But to date, what we do see is that the light C population is not as representative of the state population, which Helen mentioned earlier. So when you're looking at this chart, you're seeing the California licensed census of attorneys compared to the census of California residents that are 18 years and older. And first thing to note is that the population is majority white as well as majority male. You also see that there's underrepresentation significantly in the Latino population, where 6% of the attorneys are identified as Latino or Latinx, while there are 35% in the California population. We're also seeing that there's more attorneys that are identifying as more than one race compared to the California population. And we were able to capture information on not only male and female, but also non-binary, which the census does not currently collect. So we have this information to allow us to understand, like, what is the baseline patterns of diversity, and how can that inform us in terms of increasing opportunities for those populations that traditionally are not represented. And so some things that we were trying to answer is, what do we know about the law school population here in California? What is that demographic? What is the composition? Are these reflective of what we see in the attorney population? And also, where are the opportunities to target efforts and support diversifying the profession? And so we introduced several data points, but for the purpose of this meeting, we did a preliminary analysis of the data that's available for California ABA law schools. And it was quickly noted that there are disparities in the population. And to make this more digestible, we looked at those populations that are seeking a JD, and we saw that the populations broken down by race ethnicity shows that in comparative to white students, you do see lower graduation rates for students of color. And so what does that look like? So in this chart, if you were to read the numbers, for every 100 white students, say for 2017, 10 black students obtained a JD, 30 for Latino Latinx, 28 for Asian Pacific Islander, and 11 for unknown. And so one thing I'll repeat over and over again is that the data tells you what, it doesn't tell you why. So we understand there's disparities, and the goal is where there are opportunities to decrease these, or at least try to support those students to successfully enter the profession, or at least graduate with the JD. So when we look closer to this data and look at a different way of doing the analysis, what we see is for those students within each racial ethnic group, we see the dropout rates, or the failure to complete. And what you're seeing here are two things. We're making the assumption that the population that came in 2014 is the same population that graduated or was seeking to graduate in 2017. Ideally, what we want to do is follow these populations over time to understand where are we losing underrepresented populations, students of color. And what we find is that for Black students entering in 2014, approximately 22% did not successfully complete. For those Latino students entering 2014, approximately 11% did not successfully complete, similar to Asian Pacific Islander, and white students having a low percentage. So again, this is just preliminary analysis to see where are there opportunities to support and enhance those underrepresented populations into the profession. So we were trying to seek similar data regarding the demographics and some outcomes for the Cal registered schools and unaccredited schools. And what we found was that we had just limited information. So while the proportion of the student population is larger in terms of students of color, we also saw that it was a large percentage of information that was not known. So this is a good opportunity to see what information can we collect, what more can we gather And understanding that the preliminary analysis that we did for the ABA schools, when looking at their metrics, we also saw that it was not ideal, not as robust as we would like it to be. And this allows for a really great opportunity for the Cal schools to offer information that can really inform us in terms of improving supports and opportunities for those that are underrepresented in the law school. And so some questions that we want to gather, and again, these are just some initial questions, is, what type of data, demographic data is being collected? And we understand this demographic information, but also understanding that these populations are non-traditional, so we may have some more part-time students than full-time. Also understanding that there are certain restraints that they're experiencing throughout their law school experience. So the transferring of students in or out, or what are some reasons that are making them at risk to potentially exiting the program or taking longer? Well, we found for the ABA data that they most recently started collecting data on the fourth year experience, which they haven't been doing in previous years or after or before 2017. Also, looking at attrition data not only by race, ethnicity, but also by gender, and seeing where there's potential understanding of groups in the intersectionality of those two. But again, the idea is to first understand, what is currently being collected, what's possible, and where are the opportunities to increase the metrics so we can understand where we can do more work.
So what we're hoping to do, is this on? Is to ask for a few volunteers to help us with the design development for the adjustments in the current annual report. What we did not want to do is say, hey, we want to do exactly what the ABA does, because the ABA isn't as robust in terms of helpful in terms of telling the story and what the BARD can do then to help support students from diverse backgrounds. And so at the same time, we don't want to say, just give us a bunch of data that you may not have. And so what we'd like to do is have, one or two volunteers to help us then craft this to get the best questions, as well as understanding that it may take time for you to change your data collection processes to then present this back to the State Bar. But go ahead.
No, I just want to commend the State Bar for thinking about different ways to help diversify the legal profession in California. I know this is, as you mentioned, one piece of a much bigger question that needs to be answered regarding diversity of the legal profession here as well as nationwide. And so just so I can clarify for the group, you're asking for volunteers from the registered and Cal group to help identify what might be helpful in terms of unique questions or unique circumstances for our students that might not be answered simply through a race and ethnicity question. And then what can we ask helpfully on the annual report so we're going to get those questions answered. And then how long it might take for schools, especially those who perhaps don't have access to resources like a Office of Institutional Research or other type of more complex data collection system, to actually collect and provide data to the State Bar. Okay, are you asking for volunteers from within this committee or from within the broader registered and CALS group?
Anyone who's willing to support.
Yes.
Because I think we can bring it back to our respective schools and see both to raise what you've raised here, as well as to invite people to provide feedback about what they see as helpful questions, unique nature of their particular students, as well as kind of what might be obstacles to providing the bar with the information that that you're requesting. But I did want to open it up for just general comments and questions as well as we move forward with this.
Yeah.
Kareem and then Dean.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to first say thank you for embarking on this journey. I come from an underrepresented community in the Inland Empire, and we are currently reviewing how we're going to bring a new law school. And so there's some facts came out in that process. And so we found out that if your parent is an attorney, then you have a more likeliness to become an attorney. And so that's more or less what I've seen. And so I'm a first generation American, and I've navigated higher education. I'm currently in a doctorate program, but I've seen cost be a major issue and huge burden to overcome in trying to access resources. And sometimes what I've learned is the resources are there, but just not coordinated properly. And so in my community, we have a school, Riverside Community College, which has an entry-level or pathway to law school program, which creates that fundamental guidance and kind of pathway, but it's just not widespread communicated. And so what I've seen is just there's no feasibility for children from my type of community to be like, I can become a lawyer, I can go to law school, because that relationship isn't there, and it's not understood, right? Like for me, if my father was a business owner, then I would understand that role a little better. And so I know, being a first-generation American, a lot of our people in my community are not working in those type of professions. And so that was something that I think has been hindering maybe access and maybe the ability to reach this profession, or maybe even sustain it, because even for me as a working parent and as a person on this committee, I have rigors that I face as well that impact my studies. And so I know the dynamics shift when you're low income and you're a person of color. It's not necessarily, the systems aren't necessarily as easy to navigate as they would for a family who has established themselves in that type of career. So I think it's commendable. I love it. This is honestly why I feel like I'm on this committee, because I want to increase that access. I want to see those numbers diversify, and I want to see more people of color at the table, just because it's long overdue. So I just want to thank you for that work.
Thanks, Dean.
Yes, I concur. A couple slides, there was one thing that was a little confusing, a couple slides back. On the ABA, for instance, you had 6% Latino and 35 that are attorneys, and 35% that are the general population. But then, for instance, for the Cal Bar Accredited schools, you had 27, but only 11% that were in the population. And so, like, so you see.
Oh, that was as to State Bar Accredited versus the unaccredited law schools. It wasn't a general pop.
No, but so see in the middle. So this is on the non-ABA school enrollment, and it's got Latino, and I'm assuming the 27% is the percent of Latinos that are in the non-ABA schools. And I'm just wondering why the 11. Oh, that's unaccredited schools, so it's not the population.
Yeah,
I'm
no.
sorry. Now I understand.
Oh, I'm sorry for the confusion. Yeah, this is the data that we have for the accredited and the registered schools.
Yeah, and no, and so I think it would be helpful on a slide like this if you had like you did with the ABA, where you had the overall population to compare also, because I didn't see the little thing at the top right. So, because on this, you've got California attorneys and California population, and so if you put the California population, I think that would be helpful on that one slide.
And one thing, we did know is that these numbers are much more diverse. And there's a larger retention or a percentage of students of color.
Yeah.
But duly noted to add that population as a good comparison point.
And I know from our school, because we track, so I'm with JFK, which is, in all of the Cal Bar schools are, one of the things we pride ourselves in is having large populations of our students from traditionally underrepresented groups. I'm sure this will come out as you study things, but I don't think there's enough categories there, because a lot of people are going to be the declined to state or unknown because they don't identify with either white, black, Latino, or Asian Pacific Islander. If they were Middle Eastern or something like that, because we have large populations of other groups that are not recognized by that. And so I would just, having more groups would get better. I know this because we see it, and it's like, how come we don't get this? And because some people say, well, I don't fit into any one of those categories. Or, as you said in one of the other ones, they fit into more than one category.
That's a great point, and we experienced that with the rollout of the new demographic survey for licensees. We've modified the race ethnicity groups to include multi-selection. Also, we included additional categories as identified by the census, and saw that there was a robust documentation of the licensee population, where we saw, oh, we have a Middle Eastern population that we can identify the percentage of. So absolutely correct, we should update those categories.
And
Thank you.
just out of curiosity, when you're talking about retention, are you making a distinction between an academic disqualification versus a voluntary withdrawal?
So that's those are the type of questions that we want to dig into to make sure that we are capturing the correct terminology as well as the reasons for those who are exiting.
Right? And then Greg?
I can maybe get this thing to work. This is Brian Bertillion. I'm really trying to take notes, but you guys are beating any deposition I've ever been in. Is there a way that we can get some of these slides just distributed with all these facts and figures? So I would really love to have this. That'd be great. Thank you.
Great.
So this is Greg Brandis. A number of different things. I don't know how far you want to go into the rabbit hole about this today. One suggestion, though, I'd like to make right up front is that you develop and we collaborate on a standard set of exit codes so that everybody's using the same classification system for exit reason codes. That they become part of AIMS, frankly, and the schools then can adopt those. I assume we'd be willing to do our part to try to have students classify themselves in one of those categories. Because without that, you'll almost never get to where you want to go. And that said, it's a great thing for your working group to actually put together and develop what that might be. I'd also like to caution that obviously we're just the smallest slice of the pie. The big gorilla in the room is the ABA schools, and they don't report to you annually on any of their information. We report to you annually, and obviously I think I probably speak for my colleagues in being excited about doing this and happy to partner, but you're still only getting a small slice of the pie given the current circumstances. So that's another thing to work on. I would also like to ask how much of this demographic data you may be able to collect at the time of state bar registration. In other words, at the time that students register with the state bar as a law student, that seems to me to be the very best time for the bar to collect demographic data on those students. And I don't know if that's being done presently or not, but you've got a demographic survey of membership. So I'm not sure why you shouldn't make them fill that out when they register as law students. This is not to shift the burden to you from us, but very often they don't want to answer the question from us, or we're more likely to get the not known or the decline to answer than you probably are. And so it's an excellent opportunity that's otherwise missed. And then you'll have core baseline data that with the state bar file number you can follow through in the following years. And one can envision an annual reporting model where that file number is part of that process for you to continually track individuals in your system. So those are my suggestions because it's probable that I'm not going to volunteer. But you have the ones that come right off the top of my head.
I am sensitive to the fact that we still have a fairly full agenda and not much time left. And so, first of all, I think what we'll do is go back to our respective schools. I think there'll be excitement about what the bar is trying to do to diversify the legal profession. That's certainly something, as Dean mentioned, that we take pride in, that's the mission of the CALSA and registered schools. I also do want to mark as something to think about is if it's part of the annual report and the annual reports are part of public disclosure possibility, that some of our schools are so small that attrition data assigned to race and ethnicity would easily pick out potential people as individuals, and we'll want to carefully think about what's available to public disclosure under the annual reports as it relates to this because we have such small populations. And I want to thank you again for your presentation, and I'll work with Natalie on how best to follow up with you. Yes. Okay, and so Natalie, we're going to shift back, given our short time, to the presentation that you started on the distance learning rules and guidelines. You had finished up with a history of where we were and how we got here, and now we're left with the discussion, right? So you had talked about both the history as well as the idea that registered schools who wanted to seek accreditation had a self-study form to go through. Accredited schools who wanted to expand their online offerings beyond the 12 units currently allowed would go through a major change. And now we wanted to give people an opportunity to comment.
And I'd like to give just a bit more background before we open it up to comment, if I might, based on some of the questions that I received prior to this meeting. One question that I received was for the registered schools, what is the reasoning behind filling out a full self-study for accreditation when many of the elements are similar to their registered self-study that they file now each year? And the reason for that is to have clarity. When a registered school is seeking accreditation, they may find that there are certain elements in which they're in full compliance with the accredited status, certain elements where they have a plan in place to comply, or certain elements where they would comply in the future and can give the evidence and plan related to that. So this way there'll be real clarity for the committee. Is this something that's already in practice today? Is this something that is conceived as something that could happen going forward? Or is this something that is already in progress? We know that some of the registered schools might only take certain of the steps upon an initial decision of a provisional accreditation. So that's as to the registered. As to the CALs, who already have the accredited status and are meeting many of the accredited requirements, why a major change? Primarily because it is a change in the delivery of your curriculum and perhaps your curriculum itself. So we're very early in the process, but we've already seen really an incredible number of models blooming in the educational world. We've seen programs that are very similar to the day program with the ability to just simply log on instead. Certain of the schools will offer a live class, but if you can't make it in that night, you just hop on and you do it asynchronously. Other programs have a completely different curriculum, not only in content, but also in schedule. For example, attending classes online during the week and in residence every Saturday, or attending online most of the time, having a full weekend in order to have those in-person experiences. So this is a chance for the Cal accredited schools to explain if they want to expand beyond the 12-hour envelope, how they expect to push and how their program will be similar or different. So that's a little bit of background. Maybe we could talk about the registered and then the CALs questions.
Absolutely. So registered school questions or comments?
Including those on the phone.
Well, since I'm here and I keep talking, Jackie, actually my question is really about process. So I have a number of things related to the application form. They're detailed questions for the most part, or edits or whatever. You don't want to go through those right now, I take it, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think why don't we can do that offline.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So Natalie, I guess I'll send those to you. Is that the way to go about it? I wasn't sure how the process where I would have sent them to you, but.
Sure, so I'm happy to collect all of those changes, and anywhere that you've got a question or a suggestion, I would encourage you to send those in. What happens after this meeting is that these materials will be going to the Board of Trustees in May for potential approval for a launch shortly thereafter. So there is this window of time where we're looking for your questions. If your school has a question, you can be sure that any other does, and so I would encourage you to ask it at this time so the applications can be as clear as possible. Thank you.
All right, so I neglected to say how much I appreciate the hard work that was obviously done in putting this package together. And I really regret not saying that. After being with this project now for 6 years or however long it's been, it's great to see it come to fruition, and obviously a lot of thoughtful work was done putting it together, and the fact that I have suggestions or questions about it diminishes that not one iota. I hope that you will appreciate. So I would also like to encourage that all of my dean colleagues who might be listening spend good quality time with these new revised rules, because they really do provide a lot of opportunity for valuable innovation, no matter how you're doing your program. That we have statistics now to pretty well establish beyond refute that these programs perform as well or better than the programs in other settings. I mean, we just had results from the most recent bar exam, statistical data, FYLC data released, And it's a stark comparison, the performance of the distance learning schools as compared with some of the others. So again, it's an opportunity for innovation that really students value, but also improves the delivery of education if done well. Obviously, it can be done poorly like anything else, but if done well, it's a great opportunity. And these rules are very forward-looking in terms of providing the flexibility for schools to find new paths that are just as successful or even more so based on the way they choose to teach a particular topic appropriate to the subject matter. So I read them again this morning in preparation for the meeting, and I have to say that though they are the product of sausage making, as all these things are, and there are things in there that I wouldn't say exactly as they were said, overall, they really are a great accomplishment, thanks to, I mean, literally dozens of people who were involved over a lengthy period. So,
all right, thank you. And I am going to get better at keeping time and keeping us on track, but we have a half an hour and about 45 minutes worth of work left. So are any comments from the Cal schools? Dean?
This is very brief. The ABA schools have increased their number of online classes that can be part of their JD program. And I understand under the rules here that if an already accredited school wants to go wholly online, that they have to go through a major change process. And I understand and I agree with that. Is there going to be an opportunity for now or for the committee to consider whether to raise the 12 unit to something more similar to the ABA and not have to go through a major change process, which is a very lengthy and can be very costly process? So, you know, a school may not want to go 100% online, but they may want to go to 30 units as opposed to the 12. The 12 gets eaten up really fast. So I'm not asking if that's, but if there was a possibility to do that, I think that would be very helpful to a lot of the already accredited schools.
I think you are presaging the next item. So thank you. I would have seated you in the audience if I had thought of it. We'll talk about it further, but rules changes are a lengthy process. That's not something that would be easy to implement in time for the initial launch of the online program, but there'll be a further consideration that we'll talk about in a few minutes, and that could be one of the elements that's added for consideration to that portion.
Thank you.
And so those on the phone and those who are here, if you look over this package carefully, if you have any questions about the process or any insights like Dean just offered, I think it'd be helpful to flood Natalie before the Board of Trustees meeting in May, so we can make sure that the package that the Board of Trustees is seeing accurately represents what the feedback from our schools about kind of the process and our approach, so that we're not revisiting this 6 months from now when we figured out that, wait, I had a question about that. So I encourage everyone to carefully look at it, and just a shout out to Greg, because you have worked on this project for 6 years. So congratulations on seeing it actually to that end point. All right, so let's move on to planning for our rule revisions regarding the accreditation process. I'm assuming, Natalie, that Donna isn't going to be able to be here with you.
Donna is available online and may, actually on phone, and may provide further comments as well.
Okay. So what we have is, if you guys remember, there's a creation of a deemed accredited status or potential for that approved by the Board of Trustees, in which schools accredited by a regional accreditor would, via that accreditation, fulfill some of the requirements of the California accreditation, with certain other reporting and disclosure still required. It's contemplated that the schools would not need to undergo dual inspections except in limited cases, such as perhaps a formal student complaint or some other identified reason. And so why don't I move it over to you and
Sure. So the context for this next part is, just to be clear, we'll have 2 sets of changes going on at once. So the online accreditation changes will move forward, but as they are moving forward, an additional revision process will begin. And this revision process stems from two sources. The first is the State Bar's Appendix I review that comes from the State Bar Governance and the Public Interest Task Force, which made recommendations that were adopted by the Board of Trustees in January. And the second is a list of requests and research items that came to staff from the Committee of Bar Examiners with respect to certain provisions in the rules. So the Appendix I program has already adopted guidelines that ask staff to do a number of things. You're experiencing one of those things right now. They asked staff to help the Committee of Bar Examiners create a law school council composed of ABA schools. They met yesterday. A CS Bars committee that allowed not only the accredited but also the registered schools to give feedback. You're a part of this now. And to continue with a law school assembly, but to enrich that law school assembly to not only give staff updates, but also to bring some of the decision makers who have recently conducted studies, are conducting studies and initiatives now, or thinking about future initiatives that can improve the quality of legal education and legal practice in the state of California. And we'll be talking about the law school assembly that will happen in May in a short while. Also on the board is further study of mandatory accreditation of registered law schools. I'm not certain of the pacing or the plan for that study, but that study will continue. And then finally, a large project for this body, perhaps completely within CS Bars, perhaps with the help of working groups if that's needed. You'll be looking at the rules in general, and you'll be taking a very full, fair, thorough, comprehensive review at the request of the Board of Trustees. There will be the opportunity to be very creative, very far-reaching, and to look to best practices from other law schools, other jurisdictions, and other areas of education. We would ask you to bring your best thinking in order to bring the best outcomes. And so this is not meant to be a tiny revision, but perhaps a major revision, or at least major thinking that would ratify the rule system that's being used now. With that said, that's a large charge, but it is one that is just beginning, and there will be more time to think about this, and it will be a large item on the next CS Bars meeting agenda. So we just wanted to be clear about what had already been adopted by the Board of Trustees in January and recommended by the Committee of Bar Examiners, and hope that you look forward to rising to the challenge, as I know that you all can.
Any questions or comments? And I just had a quick question, and this might be more for Dusty. Is the question of who controls the deemed accredited status, is that a legislative action needed, or is that within the power of the Board of Trustees?
Sorry, which is the legislative?
I'm asking.
Yeah, but I'm going to turn this back over to Natalie, because I think Natalie, who's been working more directly in this, probably knows the answer.
Okay, great. Sorry. This is with respect to the mandatory accreditation?
No, the deemed accredited status, is that something that is statutory in nature? The ABA are identified as meeting deemed accredited in certain statutes, or is it within the purview of the State Bar to allow for new schools to be within the umbrella of deemed accredited?
The proposal that's contemplated here should be within the current umbrella. The ABA deemed status is statutory, but the additional deemed accredited through regional accreditors is not intended to be.
Right. Now that you say that, I remember that, yeah, we just, we think within the State Bar Authority that we can move forward with that.
Thank you. Okay, so next up is agenda setting. Oh, I'm sorry, Greg. Did you
I just have a really quick question. I promise not a lot. Is it possible to get a list of the changes that were requested by the CBE, or did you? One of the bullet points you mentioned was there was a list of changes requested by the CBE in the upcoming rules. Did you list them all out just now in the presentation, or is there another list somewhere, or is that in minutes I should go look at? Just give me a little guidance.
In past minutes, the bulk of the changes relate to the major change process.
Okay.
And then there are some small cleanup changes here and there. They were not created as part of this larger sweeping change. but they were created in the spring as part of several discussions. There was a request to look at the major change rules as to the quantum of information that should be included. But really the charge was to look at them rather than to make specifically this or that change.
Okay, thank you.
And this is Donna Hershkowitz, if I may add. This really is an opportunity to take a look at all of the accreditation rules. We know we've got these certain areas that we want to address with the deemed accredited status, and what does that mean? What specific standards, as Jackie had mentioned in her opening, what specific standards that apply to the CALs would also apply to these deemed accredited? At what point would there be site visits? What kinds of complaints might result in site visits? Looking at these major change requests that Natalie was just mentioning that came up as part of the CBE meetings when we were considering certain major change requests and having questions about the type of information we'd be looking at. But this is really an opportunity. We think that as we had talked about with when we met with the law schools back in October, we talked about the idea of wanting to really take a look at our accreditation philosophy and figure out, what is the purpose of our accreditation and do our rules match that? Should we be more outcome focused or remain input focused? Making sure that our rules follow the best practices for accreditation overall. So this really is an opportunity, Greg, not just to focus on specific questions, but really to focus on our accreditation strategy in general and all of the rules that revolve around that.
Thank you, Donna. Very helpful.
Thank you. So now we're moving on to the agenda setting for the upcoming law school assembly.
Now ask Michael to place that agenda for the law school assembly up on the screen for everyone to see. It was sent in advance to the CS BARS members. I briefly mentioned in the prior presentation that the law school assembly, offered for many years, will change in scope and format this year. It will be coming up on Tuesday, May 7th here in San Francisco, here in this room, as well as Wednesday, May 8th, repeated in Los Angeles. It's meant to be a live presentation, and it will give not only State Bar updates, but also will focus on specific deep dive topics that are of current concern here at the State Bar related to strategy. So I wanted to quickly summarize the topics that are included, just to give comment to the group and to share to you the way that the State Bar is thinking about the law school assembly, to think about topics not only for now, but also for future assemblies. And I'm going to move over to the next chair just so I can see slides while I'm talking. Okay, so we'll be doing a couple of things differently this time. The first one is we're asking for information from you in advance. And so the deans have already received a short questionnaire that we're asking you to fill out whether or not your school can attend, but of course we hope your school can attend. And we're collecting information in the area of access and inclusion to help prepare the several presentations that I'll mention in a moment. I hope you're able to see through the conversation with Helen and Carolina that there is a deep understanding in the Access and Inclusion group of the unique elements that the CALs and the registered schools bring to the process, and providing your survey answers will help them to better address that and create programs that are best for all of the schools. So we will send a reminder as to that survey link, and we would encourage everyone to please fill that out.
Kareem Bangora has joined the conference.
Hi, Kareem. So Kareem is in transit, and he's calling back in, joining us. Thank you. Okay, so just quickly, at the Law School Assembly, some things that we've already discussed today are the Ames update. We'll give a larger Ames update to the broader schools, as well as a more future-focused discussion about the bar exam strategies and stories At that time, students will still be able to register, and we'll remind folks of that. But also, you'll have the study creators there, and they will be talking in depth about how the information will be evaluated. And if this program goes forward, how should it go forward? Should it be offered through the State Bar independently? Should it be made available to law schools? At the Law School Council, some of the deans wondered, could it be offered and would it be effective if it were offered at a different time prior to the bar exam? And I don't know if that's known yet. These types of strategy questions are the sorts of things that we can tackle when we have the study founders with us, and they include an attorney as well as an expert in psychology who are creating this and will be here with you. Does anybody have any questions about that topic before I move ahead? Okay, the next topic we'll have is an update on the bar exam studies, and we'll be bringing an additional element, which is feedback from the deans. So you will get a perspective of the bar exam studies, not only from staff and the study creators and study participators, but also the deans that are on the working group, including our own Dean Gardina, as well as Dean Stephen Ferrulo from San Diego. So we think it's important for you to hear about these studies from a number of perspectives, and also to be able to directly provide your feedback from one dean to another. That will be part of this meeting. The next item is a deep dive about moral character on 2 levels. The first involves the moral character working group that's being formed. I won't spend too much time about this here because you're about to discuss it in the next item on your business agenda. But what I will add is a special deep dive with the director of the Stanford Center on Criminal Justice Law, Debbie Muckamal. She'll be presenting some highlights from a brand new study regarding the role of rehabilitation in moral character determinations, and you'll be able to hear from her directly. Mark Torres-Gill here at the office attended a roundtable talking about some of the inputs, I believe, about that study and about rehabilitation in general, and I know that it sparked excellent discussion, so that will continue. Is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, Debbie Muckamal is the executive director of the Stanford Criminal Justice Center, and what they do primarily is to, it's a research and policy institute that looks closely into criminal justice issues primarily. I know that they are, and I did have the pleasure of attending a roundtable last year that was very interesting and informative. They are coming out soon, I believe, with a study that is the sort of culmination of that roundtable and other research they've done in the criminal justice area as it relates to moral character determinations, not just within the context of California's moral character process, but in the context nationwide and other moral character related issues, again, related to criminal justice issues. So I think it should be a very interesting discussion.
The next topic is an extension of the program that you just heard, law school retention for students from diverse backgrounds. So today we talked about collecting the data in order to focus the efforts. What we'll be talking about at the Law School Assembly are some of the programs already in place, and several law schools will be giving presentations about their current retention programs. And the survey that we're talking about will also ask you about the retention programs you have in place at your schools, as well as the types of resources that you feel you would need going forward. And those discussions will be moderated by the chairs of the Council on Access and Fairness at the State Bar, and they are Judge Brenda Harbin-Forte here in Northern California, as well as Judge Holly Fujie in Southern California. And then finally, we'll have another effort from the Office of Access and Inclusion, which looks at an overview of the California Justice Gap Study. And I know that Donna may jump in a little bit about this if she wishes, but really this is going to be a very far-reaching study looking at California consumers' legal needs, if they're being met to date, and what happens in the process of the pipeline to law school, and thereafter that helps position law students to serve those needs, or hinders law students from serving those needs. And some of the data that we'll be collecting from you for this presentation involves cost of attending schools, which can be very flexible among the CALs and the registered schools, as well as any type of loan repayment programs for those schools that do offer student loans or other types of loans as part of their package. Finally, we'll be talking about the potential elimination or adjustment of certain bar examination sites in future years. Let me underline the part that says in future years. There is no plan to change any site that is scheduled for the July bar exam. But given the changing demographics and availability of not only sites but also proctors in certain areas, we are analyzing where students take the bar exam, where the capacity is needed, and what might best serve students at reasonable costs in the future, as well as potentially looking at some new sites that haven't had the bar exam as a place to be offered in the future. So overall, what I want to communicate is that really the State Bar is looking to bring you closer in the midst of these initiatives related to the bar exam, how it is offered, where it is offered, what is tested, and how the profession is diversified. We're bringing you in with the study leaders that you might not have gotten a chance to speak with directly before in a full day, I'll say relatively leisurely format from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., although I imagine, like today, that once the discussions start, a 5-hour format might actually pass quite quickly. So we look forward to your comment, and we also hope that you will be marking your calendars for relevant law school teams to attend these programs. Are there any questions or comments? Greg?
And Natalie, I think it's an excellent agenda, and I'm sure it'll be very engaging for everybody. I want to compliment the staff in putting it together. But the only thing that I see missing is maybe something about remote proctoring that is not presently listed there. I don't know if that's appropriate for this setting or not, but obviously the law school assembled folks will be dealing with student questions about it as it is tested and what have you. That might be something useful to add. The other question was, as I understood, weren't there expected to be 2 sessions of this, one in LA and one in San Francisco, is that right?
That's
so
correct.
We're only looking at one, but it's the same agenda in both.
It will be exactly repeated,
Okay.
and the guests that are available north will be available in south,
Okay.
with the exception that some moderators may change. So for example, Judge Harbin Forte will be north, while Judge Fujier is south.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
But each site will hear from a chair of the COAF.
Thanks, Natalie. I also want to commend the State Bar. I know some of the feedback regarding law school engagement was to make the law school assembly rich and deep and really meaningful to the law schools. And I have to say this agenda certainly covers a great deal of information and depth. So thank you to the State Bar staff. And so now moving on to our last agenda item, which is the candidates for the Moral Character Working Group. The Law School Council charge today, or the CS Bar's charge today regarding the Moral Character Working Group is to select a participant from a registered school and a participant from an accredited school to serve on the working group from amongst the applicants of interest received. But before we do that, I wanted to give Mark an opportunity to explain what the working group is being formed to do, and then we can move forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I know that we're up against the clock now, so I'll make this very short. But, you know, as I think all of you know, that an important part of the application process in order to become licensed as an attorney in this state is to go through the moral character background check. And in fact, I think most schools have sort of a parallel system, you know, in their, that's part of their application process as well. As part of Appendix I and the State Bar's overview of its organizational practices and structure, one of the recommendations, some of the recommendations that came out of that study was to have the State Bar review its standards and the guidelines that are used in connection with its evaluation of the moral character process, among other things that we're doing within the context of moral character. The Moral Character Working Group its charge is going to be to review the standards and the guidelines that we've been using in order to promote in order to create standards and guidelines that are more transparent, to make them more consistent, and overall to make perhaps to make them more predictable, create more predictable outcomes, both in, for the benefit of the State Bar, but also in fairness to the students and the applicants who apply. So the Moral Character Working Group will be looking at things such as rehabilitation, perhaps reviewing what that means, and looking at it within the context of updated societal values, to mitigating aggravating circumstances, and taking a high-level review of what we do in this area and how we do it. I believe we have let me get back just a second. The Moral Character Working Group will be comprised of 7 members, 3 members of the CBE, and one member from an ABA accredited law school, one from a California accredited, and one from a registered law school. In addition, we'll also have as a participant a representative from the Stanford Criminal Justice Center who graciously agreed to participate. So those will be it'll be a small group in order to create better engagement and productivity of the group. So it should be an exciting group. The recommendations that are made here today, I believe there have been some individuals from the different schools have already expressed an interest. I believe the chair is aware of those. Right. And the recommendation of this group will then be presented to the CBE at its meeting on Friday for the CBE's consideration. So that's my presentation.
Thank you. Very, very concise. Appreciate that. So we do have the opportunity to have a representative from the registered schools and a representative from the Cal schools. We did receive 2 applicants from registered, 2 applicants from the Cal schools. I was able to review those because we're a sub-entity of the CBE. We are adopting many of the same processes that are in place for other CBE committees and sub-entities, which is that the chair and the vice chair, me, normally choose kind of the nominees and then make a recommendation to the larger group. So I had the opportunity to review the applicants from each, and I know one of the applicants from the Cal schools, given all that was happening at the law school, wasn't clear could fully participate through the time frame. So we ended up with one applicant that could fully commit to the program. So my recommendation, a motion for approval by this committee to appoint from the Cal School, Dean Patrick Pigott from Humphreys University Law School, or School of Law, and then from the registered, Dean Michael Clancy from Northwestern California University School of Law. Do I have a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All right. All those in favor? Opposed? Abstained? Okay. Motion moves. All right. So it appears that we have made it to noon. So I actually was successful in completing the entire agenda within the 2 hours allotted to me. So I appreciate everyone's participation at our first CS BARS meeting, and really appreciate the staff's work and the presentations we heard today. Incredibly helpful, and excited to move forward on the work that we're doing. So thank you, everyone.
I only have one question. I believe today we're to decide the terms of members of.
I believe after the meeting has adjourned, we're going to draw lots.
Okay.
Okay. All right. And I think everyone is welcome to have Ames presentation who's present here today.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. How do I officially adjourn? You may entertain a motion to adjourn. Oh, I'm entertaining a motion to adjourn. All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. And so we are adjourned. And so